Hi everyone. I figured since everybody's going to be at different places that we probably maybe should make a video, kind of just talk a little bit about how to code. So at this point you've done some of the practice and you've seen some of the function stuff that's in there. And the reason we use a function is simply a way of writing our code in one little section. It makes it easier to change rather than changing a section of a whole program. And what the purpose of a function is, it has that little section of code, and in the main program we can call that function. Or if we have different functions, we can call a different function depending on what the user wants to do. So maybe you wanted to solve a converter where you converted Celsius to Fahrenheit, and you have another one Fahrenheit to Celsius. So you make each of them as their own small block of code, and then when you need them, you ask the user, do you want to convert Celsius to Fahrenheit or Fahrenheit to Celsius, and then you call the actual function. So I'm going to write a function that the question in your notes says try to make your own function that'll make an average of two numbers. So when you make a function, you have to type the word def. So you're defining a function. I'm going to call it averages. And I put close the brackets on there. That tells Python that this is a function. And then you have to put the colon at the end. So we're going to ask the user for two numbers. So if I want to write an average, I need two numbers. I need to take number one and number two, add them together, divide by two. That's something you probably should know, but if you can't remember, you can ask these questions, right? So I'm going to call it number one, and whenever we're getting input from the user, we type eval. Sorry, whenever we want input, we type input. So this means the user is going to provide input. So I'm going to give a statement. I'm going to use a single quotations. What is the first number? This simply asks for number, and it's going to record it as a string because everything is input as a string in Python unless we tell it otherwise. So I want to change it to a number at this stage, so I'm going to put eval. That means evaluate and turn it into a number. And I should put a comment that says ask user for a number. Now before I go any further, I'm going back up to the start here. I'm going to type this in because I should have this practice example. I'm looking for your comments all the time. Practice example. Comments always have the hashtag or the pound symbol. And September 30th. Make sure you put those in there. So that asks the user for a value. Anytime you have a function, you always have to indent, so tab 1. Now I'm going to ask for another number. I'm going to copy and paste that. I'm going to call this one number 2. And we talked about variables briefly. It's in there. The clearer your variable is, the less information you have to put in here for a comment. And comments, you can run without comments. You won't get full value. And then if you look back, you really don't know what you're doing. So comments are important. The average of two numbers. So average is equal to, and the equal sign assigns it. You'll notice you always have one variable by itself on the left, and then whatever you're doing is on the right, whether it's a math function, if you're asking for input, if you're printing out a statement, whatever the case may be, it should always be on the side. So I'm going to say average, and the average is simply number 1 plus number 2 all divided by 2, because there's two numbers. If we had 5 numbers, then you would have number 1 plus number 2 plus number 3 plus whatever divided by the total number of numbers that you have there. I'm going to put a comment in here. I'm going to tab over so they kind of line up. Takes average of numbers. And then I want to print. So the print statement says the average is colon, and then put a apostrophe there. That says what is going to print, and then after the apostrophe you put in what you want to print, what variable you want to print. So I'm going to put average here. So that's my print statement. This is the function called averages. This is what we will run, and that will, when it runs, it'll ask you for two numbers. It'll take the average and spit you out an answer very fast. If I wanted to do another one, if I wanted to do 2 numbers or 3 numbers, then I could run 2 of them. So just hold with me a second. I'm going to type out the rest. So now that I have my function, this part is the main. This line is the same in all the ones that we're going to write. And it says if double underscore. So you read that part that said dunder name equals dunder main. It means double underscore name double score equals equals. So if I have an if, I have to have the double equals. That's checking to see if this equals this. Those have a colon at the if. This is just a Python thing it does. You don't have to worry about it. You just need to use it. This part here I'm going to call averages. That right there says that call the function called averages. So when the main program runs, when I click run up here, so click run, it's going to ask you to save it. You're going to click OK. You can't see all of that because I'm half screen, so OK. And this is in your shell. So it runs. What is the first number? First number, 6. Second number, 8. So I didn't put a space in there, so like I need to do a little bit of formatting. What is the average of 6 and 8? It should be 7. The average is 7. So that's what it should run like. I'll move that back out of the way. Now I'm going to restructure this a bit. If you read in the notes, it talks about parameters and arguments. I could rewrite this program to include parameters and arguments. So I'm going to take a second. I'm going to restructure it a little bit. Just bear with me for a second. All right, so we've rewritten this code. This one you'll see up here now I've says define averages, and I've got number 1 and number 2 in the brackets that wasn't there before. So if I look at this, this is called a parameter. This part right, these two right here are the parameters. These are what things are needed in order to run this program. Down here, they're called the arguments. So these arguments I ask now, instead of doing it all in the same method, and it doesn't matter, both will work the same. Depends on what I ask you for. If I ask you for parameters, you need to have these in here. So the parameters are this function called average has a mathematical equation that says average equals number 1 number plus number 2. Right now it doesn't know what number 1 number 2 is. It just knows that it needs them, and so they're called parameters up in your function. These right here are the same numbers, and they're called the arguments. And so you ask for them, and then you call the average function, and they get passed into here, and they're in the order, so you reference them number 1 and number 2. Then this function, averages, knows number 1, number 2 are coming before it. It puts them in here, and then it gives you an answer. So when I run it, I'm going to do this here before I do that. I'm going to put space in here. So now when I run it, run the module, click OK. It says what is your first number? I'm going to click 10 this time. Second is 20. And look at that. I just noticed this now. The average is 15. I didn't fix my code completely. Over here, this should say what is the second number, so I'll have to go back and fix that up. And I should also have in here this calls the average function. Now I'm going to add one more piece of this. I'm going to pause it. I'm going to write another piece of code. And you'll see what happens here. So now what I've done is I have my average function with my arguments, number 1 and number 2. And then I have a one called sum, which is number 1, number 2. So it's going to use the same numbers. It's going to ask for the 2 numbers. So it's going to ask me 2 numbers. And I'm going to call the average function, and I'm going to call the sum function. And when I do this, it should show, it'll ask me the 2 numbers, it'll give me the average, and it'll give me the sum. So let's try running this. Run it. Here's what it looks like over here. Sorry, minor glitch. I just reset it. So sometimes you get down the bottom and it gets too crowded and it's messy, so I just closed it and then ran it again. So what's the first number? 10. Second number, 20. You know the average of 10 and 20 is 15. Because you use the eval, it's going to give you a decimal number. So it gave me the average is 15.0 and the sum is 30. Average of those two is 15, the sum is 30. So that was 2 functions in the same one. So I could have wrote this code in here, but then the whole program gets messy. So by writing the functions, then I can just call them. So this right here, this calls the function, the sum function. Now, one more piece I'm going to add on this. I know it's a long video, but you can watch it in parts and it'll help you later. So this last little piece, I added a bit of code. So if you look at the video before, it said, or the earlier part of this, it had sum, and then I had print the sum is. So what I've done is I've got something called return. So when I run the function, so down here, sum, then when I call it, when I call the average, it's here, and it runs like we just did. This one calls, it says sum is number 1 plus number 2, and it says return sum. So instead I've switched it up, and I put print, the sum is, so there's my statement, and then I call the function inside of the print statement. So then it still uses number 1 and number 2, and it's going to return the value of sum at this point. So if I run it, it's going to say, what's the first number? Let's do 10 again. Let's do 30 this time. The average of that's 20, and the sum is 40. So there we go. And that worked. So that's just kind of an example video of how you can write the code for this. I know it's a little longer than most of my videos, but I think if you watch through it, it'll give you some help on doing your other assignments along the way. So I hope that helps. Of course, anytime you're stuck, just ask me in class, but this should help you. Thanks.